I've never seen a taxi driver this cruel. A man pushed a drunk girl into the car, watching her roll around, looking completely wasted. The man then tipped the driver some money and told him to take her home. The girl sat in the car, sobbing uncontrollably. What happened 10 minutes ago had left her deeply distressed. The driver looked through the mirror and saw her clothes were disheveled. That's right, she had been assaulted. The driver changed course and took the girl to the hospital. Then, he went to the room where the person who hurt her was and lied that the fare wasn't enough for gas. Everyone in the room was wealthy and didn't care about a small amount of money. One of them gave him a black card, telling him to swipe it freely. It was obvious that he looked down on the driver, and maybe he wouldn't even ask if the woman was safe getting home. Someone asked, "Did she get home safe?" The driver replied, "No." He said the woman was getting her stomach pumped at the hospital. This group of people not only drug her, but also took turns assaulting her. Usually, the driver would give them a chance to apologize, but tonight, he wouldn't. The rich guys realized they were in trouble and locked the door, trying to let the dog out. The driver didn't say much. He pressed the timer button. This was his routine before he acted. "You mess with the wrong guy, old man," the rich guy said as he threw a punch. The driver dodged and countered with 2 blows, breaking the guy's arm. Another one charged, but the driver didn't hesitate, dropping down to teach him a lesson. He wasn't trying to kill them, just scare them straight. The 4th guy got even worse. The whole thing lasted only 29 seconds, and the driver seemed pretty satisfied. The last guy was too scared to move. The driver told him to call the cops and confess, then snapped his left wrist as a warning. And as for why he left the right arm alone, it's because he still needed to give the driver a 5-star rating. He used to be a top-notch agent for the intelligence agency, but because he was tired of all the fighting, he faked his death in an accident to go off the grid. He ended up in Boston, living a quiet life. He got a job at a big box store, but on his very first day, a robber came in and scared the cashier half to death. Robert, keeping his cool, stepped up and took out the money as the robber asked. But as soon as he handed it over, this punk got greedy and demanded the cashier's ring. She instinctively refused because it was the only thing her mom left her, but the robber didn't care. Seeing the situation was about to spin out of control, Robert's eyes turned sharp, but just as he was about to make a move, 2 kids walked in. Robert didn't want to risk hurting innocent people, so he held back. But he made sure to memorize the tattoo on the robber's neck, then told his co-worker to take off his ring and hand it to the guy. The robber grabbed the ring and quickly made his escape. Robert immediately took off after him, jotting down the license plate number. He then went to a nearby stand and picked out a hammer. The next day, when the cashier opened the cash register, she saw the missing ring was back. And that's how Robert got it back. After taking care of business, he wiped the hammer clean and left it on the display, going back to work like nothing had happened. Robert might look intimidating, but that's really because he can't stand bad people. Normally, he's very friendly with his co-workers, sometimes even dancing around to make them laugh. After work, Robert usually goes to a coffee shop to read. His late wife loved doing that, and it's the only way he is left to remember her. He met a girl there. Through their conversations, he learned about Terry's life, which was full of pain. Terry dreamed of becoming a singer, but now works as a prostitute under the control of the Russian Mafia. Terry is so tired of having to meet disgusting men every day. Gradually, she realizes she feels very relieved when talking to Robert because Robert doesn't look down on her but thinks she can become a singer. Over time, the two become close friends. However, that evening, Terry came here to drink something as usual but hadn't even warmed her seat before receiving a phone call. It was her boss, Slavi, forcing her to go and service a client, and that client weighed around 150 kilos. Terry thought about using tiredness as an excuse to refuse, but the fat guy had specifically requested her. So even though Terry didn't want to, she still forced a smile, put her arm around his shoulder, and got into the car. Robert, sitting in the corner, saw this scene, feeling a mix of emotions he couldn't quite place. The next evening, he bought Terry a piece of cake and noticed the bruises on her face. So he invited her to sit down and talk. "What happened to your face?" "I just bumped into something." Robert, feeling awkward, didn't press further. Terry then took out a demo CD she recorded and asked Robert to listen to it and give her some feedback. After receiving the CD, Robert smiled and explained to Terry just like a caring family member. He said if she had ambitions, she should boldly pursue them, and nothing is impossible. You know what I do for a living. Robert knew Terry was insecure about her job, so cheering her on might seem more like mockery. Still, his words deeply touched Terry. That night they talked for a long time, but on their way home, a car blocked their path. It was Slavy, the head of the Russian Mafia gang. The guy showed up and slapped Terry right across the face. Turns out, last night Terry picked a fight with that fat guy, which is why she had a bruise on her face. Slavy wasn't happy with what Terry did. Robert was standing nearby and saw the guy was packing heat, so he knew it wasn't a good idea to step in. He just stood there and watched as they took Terry away. Slavy thought Robert was just another John, so he slipped him a business card. He said Terry wasn't the best girl he had, so if Robert needed something else, he could give him a call. A few days later, Robert noticed Terry wasn't at the cafe anymore, and he started to worry, even while he was at work. Then that night, the cafe owner told him Terry got beat up so bad she was in the ER. Robert was stunned when he heard this. He rushed to the hospital immediately and saw that Terry had been severely beaten. Robert blamed himself. If he had stepped in to help that night, maybe Terry wouldn't be in this state. He learned from Terry's friend that the person who beat her was a mafia boss named Slavy. Her friend tearfully told Robert that Terry had been working there since she was a child, always hoping that one day she could live her own life. But Slavy had crushed that dream. The only reason he hadn't finished Terry off was that he wanted to use her as an example to scare the other girls into obedience. Back home, Robert saw the music record that Terry had given him and remembered the helpless words she had spoken to him that night. He decided to help Terry escape her terrible situation. He went to the address on the card and found Slavy's bar. Robert wasn't the type to get hasty, so he decided to probe first. He offered Slavy $10,000 to release Terry, but the guy just laughed. He said Terry would make him that much money in a few days anyway, clearly not planning on letting go of his money-making machine. Slavy told Robert to take the money and get lost. If this bunch preferred penalty drinks to free ones, Robert wasn't going to waste any more time. He grabbed the money and headed straight for the door, but he didn't leave right away. Instead, he locked the door behind him. He was going to make them pay for this. How sharp were this top agent's observational skills? He could glance around a room and instantly figure out how to turn a glass of wine, a small knife, and a bottle opener into murder weapons. While taking in the scene, Robert calculated the time, 16 seconds. As soon as he said it, he started the timer. A goon carrying a hot item walked in. Robert punched him once, twisted his arm, and sent him crashing into the boss. He flipped the knife embedded in another guy's chest and casually used it to dispatch another one. The bald guy tried to fight back, but Robert took him down just as quickly. This last guy got it the worst. Robert straight up stabbed him in the chin with a corkscrew. Talk about brutal. After the fight, Robert checked the time, but it took him 19 seconds. He just shook his head, speechless. That mafia boss, even in death, wouldn't understand what kind of monster he messed with. Robert cleaned up the blood, then vanished from the bar without a sound. The next day, he went to work like nothing happened. Of course, the news blew up about it. Cops think it was a gang war. Robert saw that coming, but he didn't know Slavy was connected to the Russian Mafia. Slavy's death hit them hard. He had all the connections in Boston, and now a lot of their business is on hold. The boss was furious when he found out what happened. He sent his right-hand man, Teddy, to Boston to investigate. Teddy wasn't just careful, he was a pro. Just by looking at a few pictures of Slavy, he knew the killer was a trained professional. There's no way someone could hurt someone and just disappear without a trace from that bar unless they were trained. Meanwhile, Robert was clueless about all this, so he just went to work like any other day. But then out of the blue, he found out a co-worker of his suddenly quit. He felt like something was off because Ralphie always dreamed of becoming a top-notch security guard. With Robert's help, Ralphie had been working hard to lose weight. Robert was worried, so he went to Ralphie's house and found out that Ralphie's mom hadn't paid her protection money to the cops on time. So they burned down their shop. Ralphie's dad had passed away a long time ago, and with him being the only man in the house, he had to stay with his mom after this happened. Robert found out about this and secretly filmed the corrupt cops taking the money. He then gave them a lesson they wouldn't forget. He threatened to expose them unless they returned the money. The two cops were terrified, and the next day, they meekly returned the money. Ralphie didn't have to worry about his mom anymore, so he went back to work and became a bodyguard at the shopping mall. Meanwhile, Teddy's investigation was making progress. He discovered that after Slavy was killed, a girl named Terry went missing. Teddy immediately suspected her involvement and went to Terry's best friend. After relentless questioning, he finally learned about Robert. This ruthless Teddy then grabbed the girl by the throat until she died. Back at his place, he watched the security footage again. Sure enough, he saw Robert enter the bar, but there was no footage of him leaving. It was highly likely that Robert was trying to hide something. When Robert got home that night, he was startled by a knock on the door. Since he had retreated from the world, he lived a secluded life, rarely seeing or interacting with anyone. His house was never visited, so this immediately put him on high alert. The visitor was Teddy, who pretended to be a cop, asking about the bar incident from a few days ago. He was also trying to gather information about Robert. Robert had prepared an alibi beforehand and answered smoothly, not revealing a single flaw. Teddy was stumped and had no choice but to pull out a picture of his friend who had died. He said the girl had died suddenly at her home and asked Robert if he knew her. "I think I've forgotten I met her somewhere before." Robert's vague answer convinced Teddy that he was the man he was looking for. But Teddy's eagerness also gave Robert away. He knew that every move a master fighter made was dangerous. In the following days, Teddy didn't just have people watch Robert. Constantly, he also investigated his background and history. He expected to find something surprising, but the information revealed that Robert was an ordinary person, as ordinary as could be. However, this only made Teddy more suspicious. He ordered Robert to be captured alive, believing that the truth would be revealed then. Meanwhile, Robert knew he was being watched and had prepared several countermeasures. As usual, he went to his favorite coffee shop to read. But as soon as he sat down, a construction worker walked in and tried to strike up a conversation. Robert immediately recognized him. "If you were an electrician, your hands wouldn't look like that." The man stopped pretending and revealed himself as Teddy's hired man. Teddy was watching the whole thing unfold from outside his car, ready to enjoy the show. But suddenly, a truck blocked their view. That's when Robert acted. He brushed the man aside, turned around and slammed him onto the table, knocking him unconscious. He then jammed a knife into an electrical outlet. Teddy's men outside heard the gunshot and rushed to help. "No witnesses," Robert said, not using the chaos to escape. Instead, he confidently walked outside to face Teddy and his crew. Teddy, wanting to avoid unnecessary trouble, held back. He waited until Robert left before leading his men into the house, but it was empty. There was no sign of Robert anywhere. Teddy and his men's every move had been watched by Robert, who had secretly installed cameras in the room beforehand. He even left a bottle of motion sickness pills on the table with plain ticket receipts to make it look like he'd left. But Teddy saw through this trick, and Robert, hiding in the shadows, was suddenly terrified. Robert felt like Teddy was no ordinary guy. He was out of options. So he went to a friend who used to work for the CIA and asked for help investigating Teddy's background. The investigation revealed that Teddy was a badass. He was a top Russian Special Forces soldier, a ruthless, cold-blooded, and brilliant guy. After the Soviet Union collapsed, he joined Brian, a Mafia boss involved in all sorts of shady businesses. This guy was powerful, with connections on both sides of the law. You could say he was untouchable. Whenever the gang had a tough problem, they sent Teddy to handle it. Just give him a target. And Teddy's style was always the same: eliminate the problem, even taking out the target's family if he had to. The reason they could hold so much power in Boston was because they had the local cops protecting them. Robert was up all night, tossing and turning. He sat by the door all night long, afraid that his actions would put his friends in danger. Why did you save that girl? I don't know how to answer that. When someone loses all humanity and hurts innocent people they don't even know, someone has to step up and do what's right. His friend smiled, satisfied. Even after all these years in hiding, his heart hadn't changed. Even though her past had made her lose hope, the man who punished evil and protected justice, the man she loved, was still alive. She told Robert to follow his heart and not worry so much. His friend's advice lifted some weight off Robert's shoulders. He went to the corrupt cop who had been helping Brian get tangled up in the underworld for years. This guy knew a lot of secrets. After Robert beat the cop senselessly, he shoved him into his car, determined to make him talk. The cop was tight-lipped at first, but Robert had expected that. He brought a CO2 tank and rigged it up to the car, then rolled up the windows, giving the cop no chance to breathe. Faced with a deadly threat, the cop finally cracked and spilled everything. Robert followed his directions to the money laundering operation. It was disguised as a slaughterhouse to throw people off, but the real action was happening inside, with stacks of cash at their feet. It's probably more money than even the bank has on hand. The leader saw Robert's unfamiliar face and immediately became suspicious. But Robert wasn't fazed by the danger. He knew he had to take out the leader first. He spun around, snatched a gun, and took control of the situation. Show some respect. Little bro, tell everyone to get down. Robert had the place under control in seconds. Robert has a clear sense of right and wrong. Before calling the cops, he makes sure to pay his employees. He gives the man a chance to redeem himself when reporting him to the police. Robert knows that after years of helping them operate, this guy has prepared an escape route for himself. He wants to use this method to awaken the last bit of conscience in him. Sure enough, the older the wiser, and eventually the man cracks. He confesses that he hid the evidence in a safe. When John retrieves the evidence, the police arrive just in time. They open the walk-in freezer and find the gang's henchmen tied up, along with stacks of cash piled up like mountains. People were blown away. Based on the evidence he had, Robert uncovered that even more officials were involved in this whole thing. He anonymously sent all the evidence to the FBI. At the same time, he also discovered Brian's oil tanker. Using the address from the documents, he went down to the docks and blew that thing sky high. And being the stand-up guy he is, Robert didn't even look back at the explosion. So Robert walked away with style. With the factory and the tanker both destroyed, Brian took a massive hit. He gave Teddy an ultimatum. Take care of Robert before sunrise, or don't bother coming back. But right now, Robert's in the dark, while Teddy is exposed, so he can't find his target, and this makes Teddy feel panicked. When he sees Ralphie following Robert, an idea pops into his head. He leads his men to capture all of Robert's colleagues and forces Ralphie to call him. If he doesn't arrive within 30 minutes, he will execute everyone there. Robert's biggest fear has finally come true, and leaving this time means facing extreme danger. But everything started because of him, and his colleagues are innocent. So even if it means walking into a trap, he has to go back. Meanwhile, Teddy has already set up an ambush, just waiting for Robert to walk into the trap, but he underestimates Robert. When Robert arrives, he knows his phone is being tracked, so he plays a trick to throw them off. This foils Teddy's plan to take him out, and in anger, he orders his men to execute the hostages right there. The two guys guarding the hostages are just about to make their move when the music suddenly starts blasting in the mall. No need to guess, it's Robert's doing. He knows for sure that the enemy will send someone to the control room to shut off the music, and Ralphie, being security, is the best choice to lure them in. So, he's already set up an ambush right here. After finishing the job, Robert hid their bodies. Then he had Ralphie lure the remaining guy outside, where he snuck up behind him and took him down. After that, Robert told Ralphie to lead everyone out through the back door while he stayed behind to face the situation alone. "Hello, that's very smart of you, Mr. McCall. I'll take care of you myself," Robert replied. "I'm ready and waiting for you." Even though Teddy had more people, Robert knew this place better. He cut all the power in the shopping center and then sprinkled some sand on the floor, waiting for someone to pass by. When they inevitably bent down to check it out, that would be the perfect time to strike. The man didn't even have time to scream for help. His comrade, hearing the noise, cautiously approached to check. Just as he raised his head and was about to draw his gun, Teddy appeared in the nick of time. He shot Robert in the arm, forcing him to take cover temporarily. He heated a metal can and pressed it directly onto the wound to stop the bleeding, yet he didn't utter a single groan. Then he placed a flamethrower in the middle of the shelf. Having learned from their previous teammates' mistakes, they no longer dared to approach. But when the man returned, Robert was already standing right behind him. Seeing his comrades silently fall one by one, The bearded man couldn't hold back any longer and fired a barrage of shots into the wall. Robert seized the opportunity, quickly rushed out, aimed for the man's shoulder, and stabbed him deeply. The movement swift, decisive, and precise, not wanting to give the opponent a chance to fight back. However, the bearded man was extremely tough. Even after being stabbed several times, he was still full of fight. The guy slammed Robert to the ground and unleashed a series of blows to his legs. Then, he picked up a shard of broken glass, ready to finish Robert off. In that very dangerous moment, Robert spotted a piece of broken glass nearby. With all his remaining strength, he reached out, grabbed it, and plunged it into his attacker's neck. Just then, worried about Robert, Ralphie came back. But as he helped Robert up, a bullet struck Robert's thigh. They quickly took cover behind a shelf. Their position was completely exposed, forcing them to come up with a plan immediately. Robert tells Ralphie he has to get to the electrical box and turn on all the power in the mall within 40 seconds, while he distracts the enemy. Ralphie runs, constantly checking his watch, terrified of missing the deadline by even a second. Teddy spots him and chases after him relentlessly. Just as Teddy is about to shoot, Ralphie manages to flip all the power switches. Hearing the gunshot, Ralphie quickly hides in a room, locking the door tightly and aiming his gun at the window. Soon enough, Teddy arrives at the door. In that critical moment, Teddy is hit by a nail gun shot fired by Robert. Everyone thought it would be an epic battle between two masters, but it turned out to be a total one-sided massacre. "Who are you?" Teddy asked, even in his final moments, completely baffled by who had wiped out his entire crew. 3 days later, Robert's in Moscow. He's got to take out the guy pulling the strings, Brian, to put a full stop to this mess. Robert takes out the goons at the gate like it's nothing. Brian's in the bath, totally clueless. By the time he hears something, Robert's already outside the door. Brian tries to buy him off with cash, but Robert's not interested in money. He just wants to take the guy out to prevent any future trouble. This time, Robert doesn't do the deed himself. Instead, he turns on the faucet and lets the water overflow all over the floor. As Brian approached to shut off the water, Robert had already rigged a wire underneath. Brian, the notorious gang leader, was electrocuted and died, a rather undignified end for someone of his reputation. All because he wanted to save this girl from a life of misery. Robert single-handedly wiped out the entire Mafia organization. From then on, he starts playing the hero, showing up wherever there's injustice. When the daughter, the owner of his regular bookstore, gets kidnapped, Robert goes all in and hops on a train to Turkey. The guy who snatched the girl is her deadbeat dad, and he did it just to get back at his ex-wife. As always, Robert gives the guy a chance to do the right thing, but he just scoffs and signals his buddies to attack. Robert calmly sets his timer, takes off his glasses, and gets ready for a little throwdown. He tosses some tea and then delivers a punch straight to the face, following it up by smashing a teapot right on the guy's head. Robert dodges a bullet and then gets the guy in a chokehold. Even facing a surprise attack, he doesn't lose his cool and stabs the dude right in the chest. Clearly, this deadbeat dad has never faced anyone this brutal, but he already blew his chance to turn things around. A scream of pain rings out, mixing with the roar of the train. The deadbeat dad also kicks the bucket at the age of 38. Not long after, the mother rushed into the lawyer's office. As soon as she saw her daughter, she burst into tears of joy. 45 minutes earlier, someone had brought the girl back, but nobody knew who it was. A few days later, Robert went to the bookstore again. The girl smiled and greeted him, but he put a finger to his lips, signaling silence. It seemed they had a secret agreement, and this matter was only known to them, heaven and earth. The neighbor, Miles, had gone down the wrong path, so Robert secretly noted down a license plate number and then stormed into the thug's hideout. An addict was standing guard at the gate, and with just one punch, Robert knocked him out. He took his weapon, stepped into the elevator, and then went up to the target floor. 3 punches, 2 kicks, and he took down 2 guys wearing huge gold chains. Clean and decisive, no messing around. Miles's brother used to be a boxer, but unfortunately, he was accidentally killed by a robber. These thugs had found the guy who did it. They could provide the weapons, and all Miles had to do was take care of him, and they'd consider him family. It was like a gang initiation, but Miles was anxious. It's easy for a young kid to rebel, but he never thought about becoming a criminal. Suddenly, the door was kicked open. Robert burst in, holding two guns, catching the stunned thugs off guard, who thought they were invincible, but who does this guy work for? The other guy's presence was so intense and intimidating that the thugs could only watch as Miles was taken away, not daring to intervene. Miles asked Robert if he knew what he was doing. This was a gang's hideout. Aren't you afraid of getting into trouble? Of course. Robert knew where he was. Miles loved to draw and had a real talent for art, so his uncle didn't want him to go down the wrong path. But Miles was born into a poor family, and their financial situation couldn't support his dream. Drawing couldn't add any food to the dinner table, and it definitely couldn't help them pay their property bills. Even though Robert never had kids of his own, he knew how to mentor the younger generation. If you want to give up and just let fate take over, then you'll have to train with me first. He put the gun in Miles' hand and told him to shoot him in the head, but Miles wasn't the type to hurt people. He only joined the gang because he thought it would look cool. Miles put the gun down, and from then on, the misguided teen was back on the right track. But doing good deeds often means making enemies. That evening, when he got home, Robert noticed the lights were on. He immediately pulled out his gun on guard. He quietly opened the door and heard water running in the bathroom. The smell of chives and eggs made him guess that the person inside was Susan. Susan was Robert's only friend. It turned out that today was the birthday of Robert's late wife. Every year on this day, he was heartbroken, and Susan came especially to help him feel less alone. More importantly, she was about to fly to Belgium to investigate a case, so she stopped by to visit her old friend. A few days earlier in Brussels, Belgium, a man came home from work to find his wife being held hostage. The criminal, without a word, quickly killed the wife, and then they forced the man to sit down in a chair. This group looked very professional. The criminal put a gun in the man's hand, forced him to end his own life, and framed him for the murder of his wife. If he didn't cooperate, they would kill his 5-year-old son. The victim was a secret agent for the CIA, so headquarters sent Susan to investigate this termination. The crime scene didn't have any fingerprints from a third party, but she found an unidentified powder on the dining table. Also, the bullet trajectory was unusual. Susan concluded that something was fishy about this case, but it wasn't the right time to go public with it yet. Dave checked the victim's bank records, and there was nothing out of the ordinary with the text messages or emails. There also weren't any signs of marital conflict. Susan decided to head back to headquarters first and figure things out later. When she got to the elevator, she ran into two backpackers who were blocking the way. Dave politely held the elevator door open for her. The elevator stopped on the 16th floor, which, coincidentally, was the same floor where the two backpackers and Susan were staying. Before leaving, Susan reminded Dave to bring some chocolate back for his wife, since Belgian chocolate is very famous. Susan had just opened the door to her room when suddenly the two backpackers forced their way in, pushing her so hard that her head started bleeding. Then they ruthlessly threw her to the ground. Although she had retired from active duty long ago, Susan was still not someone to be messed with. She used her ring to slash one of the criminals across the cheek, then mustered all her strength to push him down. Seeing this, the other guy rushed in to help, but unfortunately, Susan was older and not as strong as she used to be. So, even though she tried her best to fight back, she couldn't escape a tragic end. Miles has been well mentored by Robert and is now using his talents to paint murals for the community. However, his streetwise, rebellious attitude is still very much present. At this moment, Robert receives a call informing him that his only friend has been killed. Robert goes near Susan's house, but since he's officially been declared dead, he can only observe from a distance. Not being able to openly mourn his close friend is a deep regret for him. That evening, Susan's husband, Brian, tells him that the Belgian police think it was a robbery gone wrong. But his wife always lived simply and never wore expensive jewelry except for their wedding ring. The CIA promises to do everything they can to capture the killer, but for Brian, it's all meaningless now. Robert examines Susan's belongings, which include a shopping list, her phone, and a handwritten notebook. He tries her phone and sees there's an unread message, but he can't unlock it. So, Robert takes out the SIM card to copy the phone's data onto a computer. Meanwhile, in Brussels, another horrific incident occurs. The two backpackers who killed Susan are having a party at their place when suddenly the phone rings. One of them answers the call, and then Susan's death wasn't just a simple robbery. It was a silent killing ordered by someone higher up. These same people were also behind the murder of the other secret agent. Robert watches the security footage from the hotel where Susan is staying over and over, and finally, he spots something off. Right when they get into the elevator, the two backpackers press the button for the 16th floor. Their target was Susan. Robert rushes to find Dave, who's out for his morning jog. They used to be teammates on a special ops team. Dave can't believe his eyes because he actually went to Robert's funeral and even mourned his death for a while. Robert explains why he's come to Dave. Susan's death wasn't a robbery, and the two backpackers knew exactly which floor to go to. The autopsy report shows the fatal wound was a stab from a 2mm diameter knife under the third left rib. This was a close-range assassination done with expert technique, and it's clear this was a targeted killing. But he still doesn't have any more information, and now only Dave can help him. Also, Susan's phone has pictures of the other agent's apparent suicide. Robert carefully examines all the details of the case. He even puts himself in the victim's shoes, recreating the crime scene with a 1-to-1 ratio. He discovers that the agent was right-handed, but the bullet trajectory that killed his wife indicates a left-handed shooter. This wasn't a murder-suicide. This also explains the reason for Susan's death. The killer, afraid of the truth being exposed, murdered Susan to cover their tracks. Robert shares this discovery with Dave. At the same time, Dave also found some clues. The powder found at the crime scene was from synthetic rubber gloves. Belgian police had also found 20,000 euros at the apartment of the two backpackers. All signs pointed to a direct connection between the two cases. Robert decides to continue digging deeper and is determined to bring the murderer to justice. But before he can find any more clues, the killer proactively comes knocking, targeting Boston Airport. Robert immediately realizes the visitor has bad intentions because he has already driven his Malibu around here 3 times. The assassin is focused on his target, completely unaware of anything else. "I'm guessing you don't fly much, huh? For the last few minutes, I've been driving in the opposite direction of the airport." The assassin's cover was blown, so he pulled out a knife, ready to attack. Robert sharply turned the steering wheel, narrowly avoiding the situation, and then unleashed a barrage of elbow strikes. The cramped space limited both of their movements, and the military knife was useless. Robert then snapped the guy's wrist and landed a solid punch to his nose. The assassin, now heavily injured, was forced to pull out his gun. Robert slammed on the brakes, pulling off a spectacular drift, then snatched the gun and delivered a perfect counterattack. He then drove out of the car, grabbed the assassin's phone, and unlocked it using the guy's finger. He wanted to find out who hired the assassin, but the phone only contained a string of encrypted numbers. This is military-grade encryption. Whoever wants you dead isn't some gang looking for payback. Robert managed to crack the code, so they headed to Dave's place. It seemed their investigation was spot on, and these guys were trying to cover their tracks by killing witnesses. Anyone looking into the Brussels attack was in danger. Robert warned Dave to be careful, but Dave seemed anxious and fidgety. He quickly stashed his phone and kept checking his watch, like he was waiting for something. But these little reactions didn't escape Robert's notice. Robert called the assassin's last contact number, and, surprise, surprise, the ringtone came from Dave. Turns out, he was the one who hired the killer. "Tell me I'm wrong, Dave." At this point, Dave stopped pretending. Turns out, ever since Robert faked his death and fooled the agency, the government shut down their operations. Dave got reassigned to a desk job. To support his family, he had to take on some side hustles, still killing people who needed to be killed, only now. Each life had a specific price tag. The line between good guys and bad guys wasn't so clear anymore, and the whole idea of the enemy didn't even exist. As for Susan, to Dave, she was just collateral damage. Their operation in Belgium was about to be exposed by Susan, so silencing her was a necessary step, and the one who carried it out was Dave. 7 years later, old teammates reunited, but this time, they were enemies. Dave made his position clear. What they did wasn't personal against Robert. Robert didn't care about that. He also didn't care what his old teammate had done or what kind of person he had become. The only thing they did wrong was kill his friend, so he decided he was going to kill them all. His only regret was that he could only kill each one once. At this moment, Dave's wife was taking the kids to school, so Robert hitched a ride, making sure they couldn't do anything to him. Goodbye, old teammate. Next time we meet, it's either you or me. Robert knew these guys would stop at nothing, so he immediately moved Gene to a safe house that night. But he made a mistake. He overlooked Miles, who was at his place, helping him paint. While working, Miles called Robert. After listening, Robert angrily told Miles to get out of there, but it was too late. Dave and his team had already surrounded the target. Robert heard a dog barking through the phone, so he checked the security cameras remotely. The assassin was about to pick the lock, so Robert told Miles to hide in the bedroom. He told Miles to find a button on the middle shelf of the bookcase and press it to activate a switch. Behind the bookcase was a hidden room, a safe place to hide. In the dim light, Miles discovered a military uniform. It was then that he realized Robert was a war hero. Looks like he hadn't put his trust in the wrong person. At the same time, the assassin entered the room with his gun drawn, but even after searching everywhere, he couldn't find anyone. Next to the bookshelf, there was a mirror, so Dave shined his flashlight on it, carefully inspecting every inch, causing Miles, who was hiding inside, to hold his breath. Luckily, it was a two-way mirror, so only the person on the inside could see out. Dave breathed into the mirror and drew a smiley face on it, then crossed it out with an X and pointed his gun at it as it turned into a crying face. At the very last second before he pulled the trigger, his phone rang and the caller was Robert. It was then that Dave realized there were security cameras in the house. It seems they were one step too late. Robert gives Dave a riddle. If you want to find me, you know where to go, then hangs up. Dave racks his brain, but can't figure out the answer. He lies on the bed, dejected and lost in thought. Suddenly, a painting on the wall snaps him out of it. It's a picture of Robert's hometown. I know where to find him. After the assassin leaves, Miles cautiously creeps out of the room, but then unexpectedly, the guy comes back. Dave doesn't know what Miles' connection is to Robert, but he figures taking the kid hostage will be useful. Robert is driving back to his hometown when he runs into a huge storm. The police have already evacuated the town. Robert pretends to be the police chief and lies, saying he forgot to turn off the gas valve, so the cops let him through the back gate to check his house real quick. Dave also quickly reached the bridge leading into town, and they weren't polite like Robert. They immediately opened fire, taking down the police, and then drove straight into town. The raging storm spared nothing, signaling that the upcoming massacre would be more crazed than ever. The four men were fully equipped, and their tactical coordination was incredibly smooth. Two of them went in to search the house. One stood guard outside, kicked down the door, and threw in a flashbang grenade to scout the way. After confirming it was safe, they entered one by one, and the team members always kept in contact with each other. They moved swiftly and relentlessly, searching for any sign of the enemy. Dave saw a tall tower ahead, a perfect strategic vantage point. He charged in, breaking through the tower's iron gate, but a flock of pigeons suddenly flew out from inside. It looked like the place had been abandoned for years. He got to the top and set up. His automatic rifle, the 80x scope, gave him a crystal clear view. Suddenly, at the 12 o'clock, there was a figure moving. Kovac fired off 2 shots but missed. Dave quickly flipped the safety off his rifle, ready to back up his teammate, and kept scanning for the enemy. They tracked the guy to a wrecked house. Kovac tossed in another flashbang, then raised his gun and moved into the building. The first-person view looks pro, but he's up against a master sniper. The enemy used a mirror to draw fire, then nailed Kovac with a crazy flick shot. It was all over in a flash. The storm was getting worse and worse, the air thick with a sense of impending violence. Every alleyway was plastered with Susan's posters. Blood debt must be paid in blood. Ari tries to rip one down, but Robert comes out of nowhere, dual-wielding knives, and executes a combo that instantly takes Ari down. Losing 2 team members back-to-back has Resnick starting to freak out, and that's the last thing you want in a fight. Robert keeps up his guerrilla tactics. He spots Dave in his rearview mirror, quickly shoots a transformer to distract him, and then races to his wife's bakery. Even though it's been abandoned for years, the flour inside is still good. He slices open a bag, letting the flour spill out, and turns on the fan, making the flour fly all over the room. Resnick, following a trail of blood, chases him there but doesn't know it's a trap. Like always, He tosses in a flashbang first. When the flower near the door meets the high heat, it explodes, throwing Resnick back and knocking him down. With his whole team wiped out, Dave's forced to play his last card. It's a move Robert taught him. Always have a backup plan for every operation. Miles is tied up in the trunk, and Dave demands Robert surrender, or Miles will pay the price. The first shot takes out the rear view mirror, the second hits a taillight, and the third is aimed right at the trunk. It's the final warning for Robert, but he still won't give up. Dave makes good on his threat and aims at the trunk, but at the critical moment, Robert shoots out the tire, saving Miles. The shot goes 10 inches wide, so Miles gets a temporary escape, but it doesn't change the situation. Dave is furious, but he's created so much bad karma that even the heavens can't help him now. A sudden gust of wind whips up the electrical wires. They thrash violently, and this fall gives Robert just enough time to counterattack. By the time he picks up his weapon again, Robert has already climbed to the top of the tower. Robert grabs a gun barrel and throws a powerful punch. He pulls out a knife to fight back, but how could he be a match for a longtime master like Robert? After a struggle, Robert seizes the weapon. Now! With a dagger in hand, his killing intent grows even sharper. He repeatedly slashes Dave's tendons in his arms and legs, then plunges the dagger deep into his heart, ending the battle. Sins of nature might be forgivable, but sins of your own making are not. The waves furiously crash against the sharp rocks, and in the blink of an eye, they swallow Dave's body whole. This is the end for anyone who dares to anger Robert, and the movie ends here.